We're moving quite rapidly here today. My name is Caroline Kuzemko, by the way. I'm based at the University of Warwick, where I'm a reader in international political economy. So I've been involved in the previous phase of UKERC on the geopolitics of energy transformation. So living proof of UKERC's broad interdisciplinarity, bringing messy, murky politics into our analysis. So this panel is going to be on the changing research context. The panel straddles lunch, actually, so we're going to have 3 speakers before lunch and then 2 speakers after lunch. Our first 3 speakers will be Nicola Beaumont on environment, then we're going to have Jason Chilvers on public participation, and then Phil Heptonstall on systemic evidence reviews. We're shifting the timing on a little bit. So lunch is now going to be at 12:45 instead of 12:30, just so that we've got a little bit of time for Q&A after the brilliant presentations. So can I invite you all to come up? I will be holding everyone to time. It's going to be 10 minutes each. And then when it comes to Q&As, you will need a mic before you ask your questions, so just so you're aware. So will we need to click on? So without further ado, because we are slightly pushed for time, can I ask Nicola for you to come up and
thank you so much.
Deal with that thing again?
Thank you so much. It's being a little bit less temperamental now, I think. Hello again, still Nicola Beaumont. Still very nice to see everybody. So I, as I said earlier, lead the environment theme. I'm a co-director, and I just want to talk a little bit about how the context around environment has changed across the UK and actually internationally to a degree, and also within UKERC. Before I begin, I think it's worth thinking about why we need to have an environmental theme. And when I'm saying environment, I don't mean climate change. I mean everything else as well as climate change. And it's often queried, and particularly when I first started researching in this area, why do we need to worry about the wider environment? We all are very well aware of climate change and our aspirations for net zero. We've heard a lot about that. We're very well aware about the importance of the energy transition if we're going to achieve net zero. However, if we're going to achieve net zero with an energy transition, we need to be really careful, because at the same time as a climate crisis, we do have a biodiversity crisis. And in the same way that the climate crisis has economic impacts, social impacts, the biodiversity crisis does too. This also impacts people's well-being, their income, their health. And it's just as important and relevant and pressing as the climate crisis. And the energy transition plays a really important role. And if we do it well, we can achieve net zero. If we do it well, we can do that without having major environmental damages. If we do it badly, we really risk solving the climate crisis, but causing a much greater crisis in terms of our environment. And why? Why is the energy transition potentially so damaging to the environment? And this is work, Astley's led this work. He's here today, and you can ask him for more details, because it exemplifies this point really well. As we drive towards more renewable energy, it takes up vast amounts of land and marine space. And I mean huge amounts of land and marine space. In the case of the work that Astley's done here, looking towards 2050 and the extra electricity needs, if we did this with renewable onshore wind, we'd be looking at taking up 13% of Scotland's area. Now, this is area that's covered with other stuff happening. There's biodiverse environments, there's farming, there's all sorts happening. We do not have spare land in the UK to just spread our renewables out onto. So we need to do this sensibly. The same story offshore. So this slide was saying energy and environment and evolution, but then I thought, actually, do you know what? It's more than an evolution, it's been a revolution. It has transformed entirely this field in the last 20 years, and I can explain a few reasons why. One of the first things I think environmental scientists realised about 20 years ago was that no one is going to listen to us if we talk about worms. If we go to policy makers and say, we're really worried because there's a worm and it's really in danger if you put your onshore wind there, nobody cares. if you can explain why that worm is important, so that worm is increasing the amount of carbon that's being taken up by that environment. That worm is making the soil more productive for farming. That worm is actually enhancing the forest that people walk in for their recreation. Once we can start to talk about why the environment is important in terms of us, our health, our well-being, our economy, then all of a sudden it becomes a lot more powerful. And what we've derived a new language, we call it natural capital or ecosystem services. So instead of talking about the environment in its own right, we place it within why it's important for human well-being and health. The second thing we've done that's a significant change is working in an interdisciplinary way. So no longer do you have teams of environmental scientists going out in the field doing some digging. Not at all. The environment theme, particularly in UKERC, is incredibly interdisciplinary. I myself, my first degree was marine biology. I retrained in economics when I did my PhD because I clearly needed to be able to speak these languages. And this is across the board. We've got psychologists involved, a whole range of geographers, social scientists, and it's so important that now we work in this interdisciplinary way. The third thing really that's happened is the activity, the amount of activity. And Rob Hodland kindly did a search on Web of Science, and this just shows the increase in the amount of publications on if you search for energy environment. So there's a massive amount of work happening in this area. We've shifted. So this is the other thing that I think is really significant, is we've gone, I think, from being a handful of environmental scientists saying, oh no, you mustn't put that there, oh no, you can't do that there, to actually thinking, well, we are going to have to put things in places. Things have to change, but where's the best place to put them? And now we're finding ourselves working with industry and working with industry, working with policymakers, as opposed to being some kind of blocker against change. And the quote here is from Ilona Armstrong, who's in the theme, and she says, industry has gone from accommodating her, bothering them about grass, to actually funding her research. And this is huge. We've also seen a policy shift and a really nice beginning to change, or more later, but it was beginning to change, where we saw environment increasingly appearing in energy policy and vice versa. And we've taken a really strong global outlook to learn from what's going on in other places. So that's what's been happening in the wider world, but here actually in UKERC, it's also really interesting. So phase one, there was a handful of environmental scientists, really very few, and very minimal inclusion there, which at the time was huge to have environment in the same room. So not to underplay the importance of that. In phase two, again, there was a small amount of core funding, and this is where I came into UKERC, and I remember going to events and feeling quite apprehensive about being one of the only sort of environmental scientists in the room. Phase three, things started to really shift, and there was a small amount of funding as core funding, but we were given money as what we called a grand challenge, and we had the program called Advent, where we started to do some really significant research. And then phase four, the last 5 years, has just been brilliant. We're integrated as an equal partner, co-director, equal footing with all of the other themes. There's 8 institutes in the environment theme. There's about 30 people working in the environment theme and covering a whole range of different disciplines. So really what you can see here is this, I think this is fascinating, how UKERC is both influencing what's happening externally, but it's also reacting and reflective of what's happening externally. And that mirroring between UKERC and the wider world, I think is really interesting. So that's been quite a revolution in 20 years. I wanted to share just a few highlights from the environment theme to give you like a feeling of actually what we've been doing. This was work undertaken by Ilona Armstrong and her team looking at solar placements of solar energy. And what this is showing is that in COVID, she had funding to do field work but couldn't. So instead what they wrote was a standardized protocol, which they published. Once COVID lifted and they could get out and about in the field, they worked to understand what the environmental and ecosystem service impacts of solar energy placement were. They did their academic exercises, which is shown along the top here. But what they also did is they worked with industry, and they produced a standardized protocol for industry to understand how they could develop their solar energy in a way that maximised environmental benefit and maximised those ecosystem benefits. And this has been taken up, and this has been used by industry and feeding into international energy. A second similar example, I need to speed up. A second similar example has been on offshore energy, and this is work led by Steve Watson. And again, similar story. We've been doing global reviews, understanding the environmental and ecosystem impacts of energy. But we've also developed a tool called the ORIS tool, which we've shared with a vast range of users, industry and policy alike. Andrew Lovett at UEA, again, similar story. We've got all the environmental evidence. We understand what the impacts are, and now it's time to share this. And Andrew's tool has been picked up by now 40 local authorities are interested in using this. And it's a prospecting tool that allows them to look at the options for their local energy development, but to understand what the environmental implications and constraints are as well. A really accessible, successful tool. Then we've got Brett Day, and he's been doing national scale modelling. And the idea here is to derive where the best placement for renewable energy is to maximise also environmental benefit. And in short, what Brett's models, I'm calling them Brett's models, this has been very much a collective effort from the environment theme, but led by Brett. And in short, what Brett has found with the models is that by spending a small amount more in terms of finance, you make huge gains in terms of environmental benefits. And these can be monetized. So here, by spending an extra 19 billion in terms of finance, you get an extra 40 billion in terms of ecosystem benefits. So huge monetary wins. And then finally, Rob Holland has been doing work on fresh water, and this is just to show that the international aspect that we've also been doing to understand the freshwater implications of the energy transition, not just here in the UK, but across the world. And I wanted to show you that really because I wanted to make it clear to you that in that 20 years, we have radically transformed from a group of a handful in UKERC, given the opportunity, to now 30 people in the team doing groundbreaking research. Looking forward, I'm really sorry, but I'm not feeling madly optimistic, which is unusual actually for me. It's been a challenging time. We've seen a shift in policy. So the more recent policy documents have been showing that there is a drive for net zero to override everything else. So environment is dropping out now from environmental policy. And there is a shift very much towards, well, can we not just damage it and compensate somewhere else, rather than how can we do it in the best possible way? This is really disappointing. And Gail, who's here, provided this very nice quote, because there still remains significant potential to get this really wrong if we don't take into account these environmental factors. And we have the expertise, we have the knowledge, we have the relationships. We've worked so hard to develop these models and tools to get this information out there. And we're ready to deploy this. But unfortunately, oh, the clicker's low on battery. Oh, it's like a cliffhanger, isn't it? Unfortunately, there has been minimal environment funded in UKERC 5. NERC decided against funding environment in this going forward. There is other energy environment work being funded by NERC, but not for UKERC, which is very disappointing. And what's so important at this moment is that we maintain our momentum and we look for integrated funding opportunities. The thing about UKERC is it enables the environment to sit so closely with all those other aspects of energy. And I'm being told to stop. So with that, I'll leave it with you, and thank you so much for your time.
Hi everyone, I'm Jason Chilvers from the University of East Anglia. I'm also a co-director of UKERC and I lead our public engagement observatory. I'm really delighted to be here to reflect on UKERC's work around public participation and engagement. And it's now widely accepted that realising net zero transitions is dependent on meaningful engagement of society, especially if we want that transition to be a just one. The CCC, the Climate Change Committee estimate that over 60% of the changes required to reach net zero will be, at least in part, behavioural and societal. So the crucial role of public participation and engagement is clear. So how's UKERC contributed to this over the past 20 years, and where are we heading? Well, UKERC's work in this area can be situated in relation to three main waves of work on public engagement that have occurred over the years. So before UKERC formed in the 1980s and 1990s, the common assumption used to be that there's a deficit of public understanding out there. We need improved communication to gain that public acceptance of energy transitions. In the early 2000s, this gave way to a rise to more active and interactive forms of public engagement, things like deliberative processes, behaviour change programmes, also community energy initiatives. Now, UKERC played a really strong role through some of its work in its early phases to this second wave of participation. The emphasis of this second wave, though, is on inviting a so-called unengaged public to participate in quite discrete, one-off engagement processes. And importantly, from a UKERC perspective, in particular parts of the energy system around particular technologies or particular parts of demand-side challenges. So partly in response to some of these deficiencies in these first two waves, a third way of seeing and doing public engagement has emerged, not just in UKERC, but across the social sciences over the past decade. And this sees public engagement as being highly diverse. There's loads of engagement going on with energy and energy transitions all of the time, and this forms a wider system of participation and engagement that is interconnected and interrelating. This is where the cutting edge of work on public engagement now is, and UKERC, I'm delighted to present to you, has been at the forefront of this third move, this third wave of work. And what I'm going to suggest is that actually UKERC's interdisciplinary and whole systems focus that we've heard about from some of the speakers already has provided a research environment in which this kind of work has been able to flourish. So an important development came in phase two. The project Transforming the UK Energy System, Public Values, Attitudes and Acceptability, which was led by Nick Pidgeon at Cardiff University. This took place between 2010 and 2013. This was the first study really to engage publics on questions of the whole system change and the whole system transformations as an interconnected set of developments, as opposed to prior work that would explore public perceptions about specific aspects of producing energy or consuming energy. And what this work showed that publics are actually very capable of engaging and they're willing and capable of engaging critically with this kind of questions about the whole system energy transformations that are required. It also identified a number of underlying societal values that are collectively held by which society is kind of evaluating the transition, the energy, whole systems energy transitions that are coming forward. Now within this we see values or principles around efficiency, environment, security, standard energy trilemma dimensions perhaps. But they go beyond this towards concerns around power and autonomy, a mindfulness of the importance of autonomy and freedom, both at an individual level but also a collective level or nationally. The importance of societal justice and fairness, and also questions around quality of life, or the question of can we improve things in the longer term, including around quality of life. And I think a key message coming from this work by Nick and colleagues was that public responses to and the acceptability of these important energy system transformations are actually rooted in these societal values. Another way of thinking about it, if you want an effective transition that's going to be delivered, then it needs to be designed with these values in mind. And just one of them, have we got a fair and just system Or are we offering a fair and just transition to people right now, is one way of kind of thinking about that. And I'll let you answer that question yourself. So what we did in UKERC Phase 3, starting in 2015, I led a project with colleagues at the University of East Anglia, which tried to take this a little bit further or in a different direction. So we developed a whole systems approach to public engagement itself. Rather than engaging small groups of citizens in questions about whole systems transitions, we started to ask the question, well, what does it mean to understand energy public engagement from a whole systems perspective, as a whole system in itself? So we conceptualized this system of public engagement and participation, and we pioneered a new method to map diverse forms of public engagement across the whole UK energy system. And as we can see on this graphic, it revealed the diverse ways in which publics are already engaging, from those that are institution-led towards the left-hand side of this diagram, to those that are citizen-led to the right-hand side, and those that involve publics in putting forward their opinions or getting involved in public conversations, to forms of citizen action towards the bottom of this diagram. What these mappings started to show was more comprehensive evidence about what public views, their values, their actions, and how these what people say and do differs across aspects of this map. And it's the right side of this map that doesn't normally feed into evidence for policy making and the big decisions of the day, but very different perspectives and public concerns and visions of the transition come from those engagements. This also identified excluded or emergent engagements that might otherwise be missed from other methods. And it also showed how all of this is actually interacting as part of this wider system. So this mapping was used to inform the design of new public engagement processes and was taken up by policymakers and practitioners, including for a cross-sector working group from which the idea of a public engagement observatory formed. And so in UKERC Phase 4, we've taken this whole systems approach to public engagement further by establishing the world's first observatory for public engagement with energy and climate change. This observatory does three things, has three areas of research and activity. It's pioneered some new methods for like comparative case analysis, crowdsourcing, and digital methods to map diverse forms of public engagement with energy, climate change, and net zero on an ongoing basis. It has a network that has made connections and encouraged learning across disparate actors and practices in this wider system of public engagement in the UK and internationally. And it's also been working very closely with partner organisations to do a series of experiments to see how these new forms of evidence and methods can make a difference in practice to policy making, to new innovations, and to new forms of participation. For instance, the observatory through these experiments has had a significant impact on enhancing a citizens panel on home energy decarbonisation for the Climate Change Committee, in shaping responsible innovation of new hydrogen technologies in wastewater management developed by Anglian Water, the water company, and in contributing to government policy making engagement strategies in the Netherlands with the Dutch government and also in the UK with DESNZ. So then, that's what we've been doing, and that's the key achievements, I think, and UKERC has developed, pioneered, I would argue, a whole systems approach to public engagement with energy and climate change. What are the priorities for the future? Well, we need to move beyond a siloed, discrete, one-off engagement processes around particular decision moments, which is where we currently operate and where we currently think about public engagement with energy and climate change. We need to be much better and do a lot more work to understand and attend to the diverse forms of public engagement, but also how they're interrelated and interconnected. And that matters in terms of how people respond to any particular decision, policy, or technological intervention that they're faced with. We need to develop whole system approach to public engagement. We've started that in UKERC, but this needs to become more widespread. Certain organisations are taking up these approaches around the world, but we need to go further with that, with new methods, building capabilities and capacities. We need to think about strategies for, say, public engagement with net zero that take a systemic and joined up approach to engagement. and have the necessary infrastructure in place. But ultimately, looking back to those societal values and whether we see an energy transition and a net zero transition that actually encapsulates the societal values that we already know are being demanded, governance actors and systems need to be just more responsive to the public engagements, concerns, values, and actions that are going on out there. And we need to be much better at finding ways of doing that. Thank you.
Okay, right, so I'm Phil Heptonstall. I'm based at Imperial College. I'm here to talk to you about systematic reviews, and particularly the systematic reviews that we've undertaken as part of the Technology and Policy Assessment function of UKERC, which has been part of UKERC since the very beginning. So this is a sort of selection of our sort of album covers, as Rob likes to describe them, starting at our oldest reports in the top left and our most recent reports in the bottom right. Peter was kind enough to steal my thunder by mentioning the intermittency report that we did back in 2006, and also the work that was done by Steve Sorrell, who I'm delighted to see is in the room today, on the rebound effect and also on the global oil depletion. That's not all our outputs over the last 20 years, because I couldn't fit them all on the screen, and one or two of those are a result of a collaboration or where we have engaged with or worked with other members of the UKERC family. So, as I said, I didn't include all the outputs because there's a lot of them. There's 150 outputs, well, roughly, I counted them approximately, spread across all various different formats, from the sort of research reports, which I just showed you, through to all sorts of things like, you know, working papers and blogs and all sorts of stuff. And although the core team of the UKERC TPA has usually been a sort of 2 or 3 people during the sort of 20 years it's been running. We've worked with, and quite deliberately, we've worked with a lot of authors drawn from across the UKERC family and wider, which means that all those research reports and various outputs that we've produced, we've worked with more than 50 authors during the 20 years that we've been working on this, and drawn from around about 20 different organisations. As part of our sort of modus operandi is that we usually, almost invariably, set up an expert group to inform both the scoping and the deliberations and the analysis of our projects. And we've worked with over 100 subject experts during the course of our projects on those things. So, contribution to policy debate. I focused here on the time what we've been cited by the Committee on Climate Change, partly because Lord David was hosted us yesterday evening at the parliamentary reception, so it seemed appropriate to focus on where we've been cited by the CCC, but also in the interest of time, because I didn't have the time available to talk you through every single citation we've had in a policy context. But we can see that right from the beginning of our 2006-2007 work, we were being cited in the CCC reports, and that message has continued all the way to more recent work, which was done by Richard Hanna in 2022 on green jobs and skills, which is again cited in the CCC Net Zero Workforce report. So we feel we've made a significant contribution there during the nearly 20 years we've been running. The next few slides, I'm just going to use these, select a few of the projects that we've worked on, and just use them as a way, these slides as a way of explaining how we've gone about the work, or picking out 1 or 2 key points which I think are of interest. It's not about presenting the results, obviously, we haven't got time for that. So our very first work, this cost and impacts of intermittency, in a way it sort of set the tone, because we addressed what we consider to be sort of a substantial long-running debates and arguments around how the costs and impacts of intermittency were framed and characterised and assessed, and we did that, I think, with some success, and in a way the journal papers that we got out of that reflected the sort of breadth of the sort of coverage which we were aiming for, because we got published in a civil engineering journal, in a power system engineering journal, and in an energy policy journal. So we're quite pleased about that. Moving on. This was work that was led by Raphael Slade back in 2011. Where he led a small team of people that were looking at the size of the global biomass resource in terms of energy. And I think the message I wanted to make here was that this is where Raf was able to bring together a really, really complicated and diverse and not very comparable set of evidence and present it in a way which was accessible and understandable. And if you the chart on the left side, which is where Raphael sort of basically outlined what it is you need to believe to arrive at a certain question, the answer to the question of how much biomass resource is there for energy globally. Was the first report that we did where the journal paper that was produced from it was published in one of the Nature family of journals. So we're quite pleased about that. Second project I want to look at is one that was led by my colleague Richard Hanna, who's at the back of the room there. And this was looking at the sort of like the sort of policy space and development of heat pumps globally. But this particular slide focused on how heat pumps have been developed and deployed in Sweden. And I think the message here is that where Richard was able to bring together again a diverse set of evidence sources and tell a very quite coherent story about what has happened to heat pump deployment in Sweden and how that had interacted with policy developments. Next up was work which was slightly different because this was work where we were commissioned by BEIS. We won a tender with together with a independent consultancy to assess the evidence for demand-side response in the UK context. And that was really good, actually, because we were working very, very closely with BEIS and with people in BEIS who were very interested in how one goes about a systematic review. So that was quite interesting. And Bryony Parish, who led the systematic review elements of that work, then managed to get a couple of papers out of that, which have together been cited 250 times, which just showed at least some academic interest in the issues around demand-side response. Second chart or slide from my colleague Richard Hanna. So thank you, Richard. You're at the back there. This is a chart, a slide that he used to explain how the process of sort of scoping and carrying out a project in TPA works, and about how we engage right at the beginning with policymakers. So if you start at the beginning of the timeline, we're engaging with the expert group, which includes policymakers. We're able to share early findings with the policymakers, in this case with the Green Jobs Task Force. And then the findings from the full review were then shared through evidence provided to the UK Net Zero Review. And then finally, we had a briefing paper and a journal paper. So you can see all the time we're trying to engage with policymakers, both right at the beginning and throughout the course of the project. Last project I want to focus on, which I did with, I did this with a colleague of mine, Mark Winskill, who again is in the audience over there. Hi, Mark. And again, this is a story of engagement. So some of this started during sort of the back end of COVID, so the engagement was virtual. But we deliberately set out to engage with the government department, with CCC, with NGOs and with industry during the entire course of the project. And we met with those various actors a total of 16 times. I added it all up during the course of that project. And so what happened here is that we were sharing results and early results and sharing the sort of how we were going about the project and discussing findings during the course of the project. So that we found a quite interesting and really useful sort of way of going about engaging with policymakers and stakeholders. So that's been I think a really interesting report. Whether or not the policymakers liked the results that we found is another matter. I'll talk to you there at lunchtime if you're interested in that. But it was a really interesting process. So what happens next? Right. Well, the technology and policy assessment function, in particular the systematic review function, is going to be, all being well, will form part of the responsive research theme that's going to be led by my colleague Jamie Spears. Jamie historically worked in the TPA team, if you go back far enough. So he's got loads of experience of this. And he was working with my colleague Richard Hanna, who I mentioned, who is currently working in the TPA theme. Partly the reason why it's going to be incorporated into the responsive research theme is that we recognise, and it's been a constant tension throughout the 20 years, is that there's this tension between the desire to do a really, really systematic and thorough job of sifting through the evidence, with the tension or pressure from policymakers to want an answer today or yesterday, ideally. So the responsive research theme will use a range of different tools, including systematic reviews, to try and respond to those urgent policy questions. So if you've got any ideas or input to what might make some great projects for the responsive research theme in the future, speak to Jamie or speak to Richard, who are both in the room today. And that's me done. Thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you very much. I think I'm meant to do this, which will say, does anyone want to ask a question now?
I was supposed to do that, wasn't I?
Oh, well.
I forgot, sorry.
Well, we already have a question, so if we could just bring the mic up because it's all being recorded. Here we go. Thanks.
Okay, is that on? Thank you. Nick Pigeon, Cardiff University. Just a brief comment, but then a question, particularly for Nicola and possibly for Paul as well here. First, I'll just say the transition and how it will affect people's everyday lives. That is a huge agenda, and I think it's one that UKERC hasn't yet grappled with. It's going on elsewhere in other research, in the Energy Demands Centre, of course. There's a new ESRC behavioural research hub, which will be looking at some of this, so hopefully there'll be some links that could be built there. So I think that's really important for us, but it's kind of missing at the moment. But my question is, Paul mentioned net zero and agriculture, and this comes back to the NERC question, I'm afraid, that if we don't have a consideration of agriculture in UKERC, how can we talk at all about the net in net zero, which is the negative? If we take CCC's analysis to be correct, which I think it is, about a fifth of current emissions are very, very hard to decarbonise. So about a fifth of those emissions, if we're talking about net, are being taken out of the atmosphere by some means. Anybody who believes direct air capture can do it and CCS is barking mad. So it's down to agriculture. So can we please answer the question, can UKERC work with net zero if it's not taking agriculture into account currently? Thank you.
I mean, we do take agriculture into account, would be my response. I mean, in our theme, absolutely. The work that Gail's been doing on bioenergy, the models that, like Ashley's work to pick up on where the energy infrastructure will go, and the same with Brett's models, is we look at that displacement of agriculture as well. Oh, going forward. Well, going forward is really difficult, Nick, because we don't have the funding. And so, I mean, that work will happen outside of UKERC now, because we will look for funding elsewhere. The other thing to keep in mind is that a lot of us, so myself included, we work with agriculture outside of UKERC. So we have those really strong networks beyond. And so that is, yeah, it is happening, absolutely. But so much of the land space in the UK is dominated by agriculture. We can't possibly think about making any kind of transition without having those close collaborations. But I don't, going forward in UKERC, this is a really good question. Talk to NERC. I mean, everyone else has, so like, join in.
Great. So we do have a few more minutes. Are there any other questions? Neil first with the mic, thanks.
Thanks. Neil Strachan, UCL. A question for Jason. Will the debate be driven, and should we be looking at extreme opinions on both sides, which are often quite salient and easy to identify, or the much harder to look at sort of general population that's a little bit on one side or a little bit on the other?
Yeah, it's a good point, and I think well, it should be driven by the diversity of engagements, which have a diversity of perspectives on where we should be heading and the values that should underpin that. And I think the challenge that we've been trying to grapple with in UKERC over the years is how do you get at that diversity? And we have our standard approaches of doing surveys and opinion surveys and focus groups and deliberative processes where we invite people and we ask them questions, but that elicits a certain type of response. What you're talking about is there's some loud voices out there, sometimes powerful people, sometimes less powerful people in activist spaces, and we hear this, it gets in the media. But cutting through that, you know, there are peoples whose voices are just not being heard. And we have to strive to look into those marginalized or excluded spaces of participation and try and find out what perspectives are coming through there, what people are saying and doing there, and bring that back into the centers of power and to shape the transition. Yeah, so I think that we're making progress with that, but you know, there's a long way to go, I think.
So we have time for one more question. I think we have one here.
Hello, I'm Kuzemko, Director of the Energy Intensive Users Group. I represent certain business interests. And talking about interdisciplinarity, to what extent does business economics is a discipline in any of UKERC's research?
Business economics. Yeah, we have an answer over here.
One of the recent outputs has been about, a few recent outputs have been about, for example, the investment, the investability of, in particular, offshore wind and where the investment is coming from, and trying to inform government about some of the risks to investment with changed electricity market arrangements, for example. So that sort of stuff does come in. I can't say it goes across, all industry sectors. Peter's been involved in terms of, industrial decarbonisation and trying to look at some of that, and that will include some, the costs, and the payback periods and the relative costs of energy and all that sort of stuff. Sorry, Paul, the investment and the payback, on those investments.
Can I also? Oh, sorry.
Go
ahead.
All I would add to that is we've done several in the TPA team. We've done several reports which have focused on either specifically the costs. Sorry, Paul, of renewable generation or different types of power generation, and we've also done reports that have specifically looked at the investability of different types of power generation and how the characteristics of different types of power generation affect their investability. So yeah, we have done that.
Nicola.
And I just wanted to reflect, because I had a very interesting conversation with a representative of BP yesterday, and I was discussing the model that I showed very briefly, led by Brett Day, that shows that if we invest a small amount more in terms of financial cost, we gain a huge amount in terms of welfare benefit. So a small amount of financial cost means that you get a lot of environmental benefits, which are also worth money. The conversation that I was having, she was saying that actually, why would BP ever pay that extra amount of financial cost? Because, yeah, that's great for society that you're going to have all that extra monetary benefit, but that doesn't help BP with its profit margin and its investors. So I don't have an answer for you. What it made me think, that conversation, is that's definitely where we need to be working much, much harder going forward.